So I was on stage yesterday at the World Employment Confederation talking about talent platforms and how important talent platforms are to the staffing industry. Now, the World Employment Confederation is a membership group of traditional staffing firms. So I would think my job yesterday was much harder than I hope it's going to be today, because there were some quite skeptical views in the room, because they obviously represent traditional staffing. They're getting their heads around how freelance talent platforms can play an increasingly important role. But I think everybody here is probably already over that sort of hurdle of understanding how talent platforms are going to change the world, or how I think they're going to change the world. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about that. I'm chief executive of an organization called Open Assembly. I'll tell you a little bit more about Open Assembly later, but we see our job as to make it as easy as possible for enterprises to adopt what we call open talent, so use of freelance talent platforms at scale, and to make it as easy as possible for talent platforms to get enterprise demand. So we're sort of in the middle, if you like. We're not a platform. We're right in the middle there, making it as easy as possible. Now, I've always been obsessed with technology, trying to make things better, faster, cheaper. I'm obsessed with ChatGPT right now, but it all started a very, very long time ago. Because this is my dad. It's actually not my dad, but it actually looks quite similar to my dad. I grew up on a pig farm in South Devon, in rural South Devon in the UK in the 70s and 80s. And I had to help my dad work on the farm before school every morning. I was sort of free labor, if you like. But my dad was, as well as being a farmer, was an engineer, and he was also a bit of a computer scientist. So he started programming in BASIC in the sort of early 80s, and his office was just full of Microsoft, I think BBC computers, Amstrad, ZX Spectrums, you know, some of you may remember. And my dad and I embarked on a project, and we literally built something which looked a little bit like this. And it was an automatic pig feeding system. So the whole idea was that we had sows that would run around the yard. They were outside and they would sleep inside at night, but they were free ranging. And the concept was, how could we enable them to self-serve food? How could they go and feed themselves rather than us having to get up in the morning and feed them? And so we developed this system where, I think if is there a pointer on here somewhere? Oh, there you go, probably. Oh, never mind. But anyway, the pig would go in the back there, would wear a collar, and on the collar was a little microchip, a transponder, and he would put his head over the trough, and the trough had a scanner on it, and then the scanner would read which pig was which, and then it would give it the prerequisite amount of food that we'd programmed into the computer. Super clever for the early 80s. This was a long, long time ago. And then we developed it even further, so we put scales into this pen, so that when the pig came on, we could see how heavy that pig was, and then we could give it more food or less food. And we captured all of that data, and you could then actually get better yields from a farming perspective. But that was sort of when I was a teenager, and it got me obsessed with not only being able to stay in bed later in the mornings and not having to get up and feed the pigs, but how technology could make things better, faster, cheaper, improve productivity, and give you so much data. So my dad actually did okay out of this and sold it to a company. And so he was a bit of an entrepreneur, which is probably where I get my entrepreneurial genes from as well. I then went into teaching people how to use computers. So that was my sort of next iteration, if you like. I became a software trainer. And this is the early 90s, as it says there. And I'll always remember the first training course I had to run was for a bunch of some lovely ladies who were working for the UK government, and they were in a typing pool, and they had never, ever seen computers before. And these brand new computers were put into their room. And I went in, and maybe I was there slightly late, but I will never forget, there was a lady there who had got the mouse that used to be on a cable, and she had it on the floor, and she was trying to use it like a sewing machine pedal. And that's how she thought it worked. So I have my work cut out, but my job was to train those lovely ladies how to use Windows. You know, they were never going to train them how to use disk operating system, DOS. But when Windows came out, it was suddenly what you see is what you get, WYSIWYG, and it was a graphical user interface. And so I trained lots and lots of people on how to use Windows. and then Microsoft Office and all the applications that go with it. And you realize then that was super transformational for them. They could suddenly get so many things done. And it was another example of technology enabling you to do things so much more productively. I then moved on into the whole internet revolution. I found that absolutely fascinating because you'd work with retailers to convince them that in 10 years' time, majority of their revenue would be delivered through a website. And in those early days, that was like so different. I worked with the John Lewis department in the UK, huge department chain, setting up their website, setting up their e-commerce division, and convincing them that they would be doing more revenue online than they would in store was just completely, this will never happen. But you could sort of, many of us could see it. And of course, it led to the dot-com boom. We worked with hotel chains. We worked with airlines. I can remember, again, working with British Airways and convincing them that, you need to have your executive club online. We will all be booking tickets online. The internet changes everything. It was fundamental. And it was fantastic to be a part of that great wave in the 90s. And then, of course, there was a crash, but, the internet has effectively changed everything. I then went into the whole cloud computing world, and there really was, people just saying this will never work. I am never going to put my data into the cloud. It will never make sense for a big corporate to put their ERP in the cloud. Look what has happened now. The cloud is it's again been a game changer and changed everything. And another example of how technology has made things so much better, so much more productive. And then final example, I then set up a company in the world of robotic process automation. In a way, it's a bit like the precursor of large language models and ChatGPT. I'm sure you've probably heard of robotic process automation. It was much overhyped at the time. But the idea of being able to get repetitive digital tasks done by a robot, like a macro, if you like, rather than a person having to do it, back in the early 2010s was sort of newish. And we all promoted it and worked with companies like Blue Prism or UiPath or Automation Anywhere. And it helped to transform some of the business process outsourcing industry that we were involved in. But again, a great example of how technology can be used to make things better and more productive. And that's basically my journey to why I'm here now, from pig farming to talent platforms. I sort of had this, I suppose, vision 5 or 6 years ago that every organization in every industry can benefit from these new models, whether it's a gig economy strategy, but being able to tap into people on demand, being able to work remotely, being able to rent rather than buy, being able to create opportunities for people in different parts of the world. They don't have to live in Copenhagen or in London or in Silicon Valley. They can live anywhere and gain access to opportunity. And that made me super excited. I started researching that. I set up a company enabling organizations to do that, which has effectively become Open Assembly. And so that's what gets me up every day, thinking, how can we make employment different? How can we rethink what a job is? How can we enable people to live their best work style, which is a term stolen from very happily stolen from my friends Alex Penny and was it Lizzie Penny and Alex Hurst? Sorry, I always get them too mixed up. But they wrote a book called Work Style, by the way, which you should definitely read, which is all about how we can use technology to enable us to organize our work around our life and not our life around our work. Now, where we are on the hype cycle with talent platforms is a big debate. You'll see freelance management up there somewhere, just going down the trough of disillusionment. I'm not sure we're at the trough of disillusionment. I'm not even sure we're at the peak of inflated expectations, actually. But that's up for debate. You'll all probably have seen the Gartner hype cycle before. But there's a lot of talk about talent platforms, freelance talent platforms, and how they'll transform the world. But to be honest, there's been a lot of talk about this for 20 years or so. Mike Morris, who's on our board, set up Topcoder 20 years ago, right? Things haven't really progressed the way we thought they might progress 20 years ago. It's been pretty slow. And the concept of moving organizations, big enterprises like a Novo Nordisk, and I totally was really impressed with the first presentation and what you guys have done here. I agree, super impressive. But moving away from those traditional models of, employee first, then staffing agencies or direct contractors or the outsourcing industry that I'd worked in for so many years, or consulting firms, moving to talent platforms, enabling you to balance that productivity, that, to scalability, that quality, cost, and performance. If you can achieve that, then you can get 60% cost savings. You really can get real benefits. The World Economic Forum call it maximizing your total cost of work, your TCW, and your return on work, your ROW. So by balancing and optimizing all of these different channels, and the channel that we help organizations to implement is the one on the right, is talent platforms. How can you use talent platforms for what they are designed to be used for? Now, if you think of the external staffing industry, it is huge, right? It's not a new industry. It's been around for decades and decades, probably hundreds of years. It's a $5 trillion market. These are staffing industry analysts' reports, as it said there on the left-hand side. In fact, I was on stage yesterday with Adam Pode, who's from Staffing Industry Analyst, who did all of this research. So I did say to him today, I'm going to be using your statistics with pride. But SIA say $5 trillion market, but the vast majority of it is independent contractors or self-employed. Or, as you can see, temporary employees employed directly, temporary agency workers. Platform work is a tiny segment. And even that platform work, as it says up there at 449 billion, is predominantly business to consumer stuff. It's, Uber drivers, it's Just Eat, it's Deliveroo. The platform related part of the 14 billion or 13.8 billion. Sorry, let me say that again. The business to business part of the 449 billion is only 13.8 billion, according to SIA. So it's a tiny, tiny part. It's less than 0.25% of the external talent industry. So the external talent industry at 5 trillion, use of business to business platforms by enterprises at 13.8 billion. It's absolutely tiny. We are a fraction of the market, but we are growing quickly at 29% versus 9%. So why has it been so difficult? Why is it hard for enterprises to adopt what I think we would all agree is a very sensible and beneficial concept? The concept that you can access talent so much more quickly, 5 times faster. It can be 30% less expensive. You can increase your fill rate. This is what I was saying to the agencies yesterday. If you tap into talent pools, from talent clouds, from freelance talent platforms, you get the ability to be able to source in a better way than you have previously, because you've got access to new pools to fish in, access to different types of labor. And it can be 30% more productive. I think I saw Alan said earlier, 60% cost benefits. So it can be absolutely beneficial. And of course, the quality can go up. But Paul, who's one of our customers, says alongside all of the other benefits, the main reason that they use talent platforms is the quality of talent, which you wouldn't necessarily always associate. But you can, of course, find brilliant people on talent platforms. What we find with our clients generally, and this is not for every talent platform, of course, we have 650 platforms that we track in our database. So we just do our own research on which platforms do what and which offer what. What we have found with our customers is that the sweet spot is when the work can be performed remotely. Obviously, there are some platforms and some agencies, most agencies, but some platforms that provide on-site as well. And there can be a mix, but we find it's easier to source freelancers through platforms for companies when the work is remote. We find it's easier when it's short term, and our sort of heuristic says less than 6 months. If it's less than 6 months duration, generally you don't have the worker compliance challenges that you have with longer term. Generally, it's got some sort of outcome which can be measured. It can, of course, be day rate as well. But that's what we generally find. The third thing is if it's a simple-ish task, or it's a task that a freelancer already knows. It's Java development, it's creative skills, it's business analysis. It's a recognized task, and it doesn't require lots of company-specific learning. You don't have to take a month to get up to speed to work on that task, and then it can be measurable. You really can measure the success of it. It's either day rate based or it's outcome based. And there are others as well. It's much easier if you don't have to provide the freelancer with access to systems, to secure systems. We don't think you should be shipping laptops to freelancers, right? Just makes no sense in the era of cloud computing. So you need some sort of virtual desktop infrastructure if you want to give freelancers access to your systems, for example. You've got to overcome all of those. But generally those four, and you can see from just Upwork annually publish the most in-demand jobs. And from a technology perspective, we see quite a lot of demand in technology. It's things like full stack development, front-end development, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So why has it taken so long for organizations to catch on? And what I described there is that fear, uncertainty, and doubt, FUD. So it's incredibly complex for an enterprise to understand which platform to use for what. So this is just an example from our site of the platforms that we track. As I say, we've now got 650 in our database, and they are all different. Some are absolutely brilliant. You heard from TopTal earlier, an amazing platform, probably the most successful probably out there. But, the three publicly traded ones, the Upwork, the freelancer.com on Fiverr. But for every brilliant one, there are some terrible ones, right? There really are. And we speak to them all of the time. And you get some that people spin up and don't really take good care about the quality of the freelancers. They won't do background checks. They won't do screening and testing. They won't offer any form of compliance. You get no recompense if things go wrong. And there are brilliant ones. But as an enterprise buyer, how do you know which one to use? Why do you decide to use one versus another? Is it the salesperson, or is it the capability they have on the platform? And so it's incredibly complicated for organizations to know which platform to use for what, let alone to use when to use platforms versus when to use outsourcers or consultancies or agencies or MSPs. So it's bloody complex. And I think that's one of the things that has constrained the growth of this industry to date. And then the other side of the coin is that it's incredibly complex for an enterprise to source directly from a platform when they haven't done it before. So most enterprises, Novo Nordisk included, I'm sure, because that's why they would have set up the program, are very used to sourcing in a certain way. They're used to working with agencies, used to working with professional services firms. Procurement is used to working in a certain way. I'm sure they weren't used to working with talent platforms when they set up their program. The processes are all different. The compliance, security, HR involvement, procurement involvement, IT involvement, quality control, all of it is different. Culture. And so it requires a new mindset. You've got to have top-down sponsorship. You've got to treat it like a program for this to work at scale. It's easy to buy ones and twos, of course, from any platform. But if you want to get the hundreds like Novo have done, you need to really take it seriously and run it like a program. And once you've set it up and you can institutionalize the thinking and the behavior, then you start to see organizations really using it at scale across all of their departments. But to start with, it really does require process change to really institutionalize it. When it's done properly, and this is sort of our best case study, it won 3 awards last year, won the Brandon Hall Award, the Tiara Award, and the Global Sourcing Association Award. There's a bit of us sort of blowing our own trumpet with UST. But UST are a sort of global transformation partner to Fortune 500 companies. They're 33,000 people, growing quickly. And they set up a program, just sounds very similar to the one you have here. So they set up, or we set up with them, an open talent, as we call it, open talent center of excellence, which enabled them to tap into multiple platforms to provide services both internally, but also to their clients. That's, I think, the really difficult thing that we managed to overcome, and the really important thing. And they did it as a strategic program sponsored by Krishna, they're the chief executive. And so we set up a center of excellence. We put all the processes in place. We went around and sold to the account teams. And now they've got a model where they can create or input demand into the Centre of Excellence, decide whether it goes to their agency, they happen to work with Kelly Services, or to HR for employment, or to the Open Talent Centre of Excellence, where it can be sourced from multiple different talent platforms in a safe, secure, compliant, insured, indemnified, contracted, and all of the things that you need to have in place for a big enterprise. But getting to that stage took quite a long time. So it's something. This is something that is going to take time to be done properly at scale, but it's now institutionalized. Slightly differently, some of the other things that we see, and I've been really excited about this, is where governments start to think, how can we use talent platforms to benefit our economies? This is not it's almost the opposite of digital nomads. So this is an example from Kerala. So Kerala is the most southern state of India. It has, and India's got complicated politics, but they manage their own people in their state of Kerala in the south. Capital is Trivandrum. It's an amazing place, by the way. If you ever get the opportunity to go to the south of India, to Trivandrum, it's an incredible state. But they're trying to create job opportunities for 2 million Keralites. And so they are basically trying to address the issue that Keralites come out of university, incredibly well educated, brilliant English, brilliantly qualified. But because it's a fairly remote area and there's not big sort of conurbations apart from Trivandrum, these brilliant people then disappear. They go to other Indian cities, or they go to mainly the Middle East. There's more Keralites working in Bahrain than Bahrainians. And so the government is basically saying, how can we encourage our brilliant local people to stay in Kerala, contribute to society, contribute to the economy, contribute to their families, buy cars, buy houses, do all the things that you do? Well, one way is to create opportunities, full-time opportunities with businesses. The other is to say, well, how can we use freelancing? How can we use talent platforms, global platforms that have demand from Copenhagen or from wherever, and that can be provided by the local Kerala population? And so we've got, you can see there, we've got 5 different ways that we're helping them to do that. We've just done a strategy with them recently, and we're now running a number of pilots to enable their people to gain income using talent platforms. Now, that's something which, doing some stuff in Saudi Arabia, that's the things that could be done in many of the other Indian states, could be done in many of the African countries. There's so many applications for talent platform use with governments that governments need to understand. And so we're helping them to get their head around how talent platforms can be used to advantage. We've developed, just like I suppose many of you, an entire process for how talent platforms can be used at scale within enterprises or within governments. We've got a playbook which we developed with Harvard University to enable organizations to follow a standard set blueprint. And obviously it starts with demand, and then creating a runbook, and through a design, refine, hire, deliver, and an offboard process to keep compliance, to keep procurement, to keep HR on board. Everything has to follow as a set process. So we've designed all of that. The thing that we have just rolled out, we've done effectively a soft launch. We're working with 6 customers this year to trial this, is what we're calling our gateway. Think of the concept like an MSP, if you like, but for talent platforms. We're trying to make it as easy as possible for enterprises to source and match with the right freelancers from talent platforms. Trying to make it as easy as possible for talent platforms to get enterprise demand. So the concept is really, really simple. An enterprise like a UST we work with will put demand down into the Open Assembly gateway, and we raised some venture capital last year, and we're building some technology for this, using some off the shelf and using lots of great people to basically say, is that task suitable for freelance talent platform work? Yes, no. If it is, then which platform should it go to? And then we're currently with using our knowledge and our database, but we want to automate this as much as possible in the future. We then pass that demand to the most appropriate platform. They can say yes, they can say no. They don't have to respond to it, of course, but if they want to, then they can respond with the best profiles. We then provide those back to the client. We then make sure that the background checks have been done, that the compliance in place. We happen to work with Deal. You've probably heard of, a global mobility provider, so they're integrated into our platform. We've currently got 12 platforms on board with this model, and we're out talking to all the platforms and trying to get them on board. But we only want to work with the best for our clients. So working with John Younger, who you've heard from already, we've set up the trusted talent platform partner. So effectively what this is, it's sort of first instance, but what we want to do is to make sure the platforms that we work with are really good, so that they've passed a test. There's 13 criteria. We talk to their customers, make sure that they are actually delivering the services that they pledge to be able to deliver. You may not believe this, but not all talent platforms are honest. Not everything you read on their websites is actually correct. And so we make sure that they really do have the 50,000, the 1.6 million, the 58 million, whatever active users, that they provide community, that they provide training, that they provide screening, that provide matching. And so ultimately we want that sort of green line to be a gateway that we will match enterprise demand with the correct talent platforms. And we'd like to get as many as possible, obviously, so that they can get demand from enterprises, and we can make it as easy as possible for enterprises to access the right talent platforms. We don't want to disintermediate. We're searching, matching. Once the matching is done, then the talent platform has, access to the client, of course, and then ensures that a quality product is delivered. It's like the sort of Amazon model. We want to make it as easy as possible, but after you've bought one thing, you don't have to go through the gateway again. You might want to, because it's safe and secure and quick and easy, but you could go direct to Upwork. So that's our plan for this year. We're rolling that out slowly. We'll really try and get sort of global expansion of that, do more and more digital integrations through APIs into the platforms if we can. ChatGPT will inevitably play a role at some point, and we're looking at that just like every platform in the world is. But we'll see how that progresses. I didn't say this at the beginning, but we were conceived with Harvard University in 2018. So we're part of the Laboratory for Innovation Science at Harvard. So we have some credibility with the scientists and academics in terms of what we do, and we're out to try and help talent platforms to change the world and access more enterprise customers. That's really our mission. Thank you. I don't know if we have time for any questions, or if there are any questions. Yes. How do you do the revenue sharing model with the platforms? It could be a conflict because. Sure. Yeah, no, we see it as so the question was, what's really the commercial model with platforms, right? So we charge platforms a small percentage for bringing them the demand from the enterprise. So that's how we make our money for the sort of, the first hire or hires, or any hires through the gateway. There's nothing to stop them if that's what the client wants, going direct, of course. But what the clients, our first few clients want, they don't want to have multiple contracts with multiple platforms. They want to have a single way of accessing multiple platforms. It's the MSP concept. So they pay us a small commission, basically. That's how it works.
Hey, Barry. So I've got two questions. One is around who owns this in enterprises. It seems to be the biggest challenge is either no one wants to, or no one's yet an expert, so then they don't.
Yeah.
And it sits between somewhere of procurement, contingent labor, HR, or nobody because they don't want to put their hand up.
Yeah.
What's your view around that piece? And then my second question, somewhat related, but it still doesn't feel like we have a name for this whole area. I heard so far gig economy, freelancers, contractors, talent platforms, open talent, borderless hiring. There's so many different names for this. So when it's discussed internally, people are like, were you talking about what we use within MSP? Were you talking about what we use with XYZ platform? And it's still quite confusing in the industry.
Yeah. Yeah, so I'm nodding. I absolutely agree. So in our experience, if it's owned at all, and it's not owned in many enterprises yet, but if it's owned at all, it's in either procurement or HR. If you get HR and procurement who like each other, and we'll talk together and work together, and that's brilliant. The reason we had a really early success in UST is because the chief operating officer was also responsible for talent. He really got it, and they had a massive talent challenge. They were like, we've got 10,000 open positions. How do we tap into platforms? And he was responsible for it. So it had operations and it had talent. But the other clients that we work with, it's HR or procurement. And and it's either or. But you're right, it doesn't always have a home because people don't sort of realize the opportunity. We're still at this very early stage of education, I would say. And then, the brand is super confusing. You're absolutely right. We use the term open talent, like as in open source. So we call it open talent, i.e. we consider ourselves talent architects. How do you get talent from the right source for the right job or the right task? So we call it open talent, but others call it other things. And that's, I agree, is complex.
I have a quick question in regards to how this differs from an FMS, which is a freelance management system, or a system that brokers any sort of demand, because FMSs generally work by providing the customer with a variety of options for talent suppliers and then take approximately a 1% fee on average. And so whether it's a VMS or an FMS, I'm trying to understand what the difference between Open Assembly is versus an FMS or a VMS. Can you explain that?
Yeah, sure. So we see the VMSs and FMSs as partners. So, we would love to get an API with Fieldglass and an API with Beeline, and we're chatting to them both. What they don't have currently is access to multiple platforms through one interface, right? So if you put a request into a vendor management system and you try and source it, it will go to an agency potentially. It might go to one or two platforms if they have access to it, but it doesn't go to multiple. So if we have an API into our platform or our system, it would enable that request to go to all of the platforms that we work with and enable them to fulfill that request. So our process would feed into a VMS. It doesn't currently, although we are working on that. So we have like a manual workaround, but we want it to be integrated, our API to be integrated into the VMSs. So that you put a request into a VMS and then it can go to all sources. So that's the main difference.
Hi, I loved your presentation here. Thank you so much. It was very insightful. I wanted to ask, how do you vet the platforms that you're working with?
Sure. So we currently have 13 different criteria, and I can ask John can actually answer that question much better than I can. We've actually been through a couple of iterations of this. So a couple of years ago, we started doing really heavy vetting. That sounds like heavy petting, doesn't it? Heavy vetting of platforms, which ended up taking like 3 months. So we had a lot of really, really high criteria. We talked to all their customers. We'd have to interview the CEOs, all of the product managers. It took ages and ages. And we've actually made it a much lighter touch process. So we've focused on trust, and we focused on what their customers think of them across 13 different criteria. Doesn't take too long. John, do you want to elaborate any more on that?
Criteria that you got, believe me, I've got a big voice. It's really the 13 things that you keep in mind. I mean, do they protect your data? Are they responsive? Are they reasonable cost, et cetera, et cetera? And what we've learned from this stuff is that it's possible to get great data from your customers. You just got to ask them, but you got to ask them 3 times before they get it back to you. And if you do that, you get a very robust view of what they do well and what they don't do as well. And by the way, it's not only for the trust part of synchronizing with a client, what great data you have internally when you're starting to get real feedback on dimensions that matter from your client. And you have to deal with a client that says, you suck.
Yeah.
And that is a very important thing. So much of our stuff are happy notes and smiley faces, and not necessarily the data we need to continuously improve.
Yeah, this is a moving feast. This will get better and better and have more levels. We just released it this year, so it's just started. But sort of watch this space. We want to do much more in this area.
Perfect.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.